Hello, folks. I'm back this week. It's a lot quieter than it has been for some time. No Kickstarter running. All manner of excitement is over with for the moment. We get to turn to something that's a little bit more of a favorite topic for me, more of the nerdy stuff. Let's talk today about OSS, ethical decision making in engineering, and how we make software safe for end users, especially in startups, where often there's not a lot of compliance, and sometimes not even a lot of experience in how to create compliance software. And we'll talk also about the definition of compliance a little bit more. Finally, I have a reasonable fill up of tea this week. I've got my cardamom tea back again. It's so delicious. Okay, so I don't have any guests this week. There was no reason to make this big one. Instead, I'm going to focus on questions that I get about how to develop software and the kind of misunderstandings that can sometimes exist when it comes to open source software, compliance, and security in startups. So let's talk first of all about the basis of ethics in software development for startups. This is a topic that I and my co-founder Liz, as you know, I'm the CEO of Fizzmint. My co-founder Liz is the CTO, Liz Dahlstrom. She's a much better engineer than I will ever be. And she and I have long conversations about how we develop out the product, how we work, and it goes back, kind of product development that we do, goes back to our own ethical origins. She and I are both ethical and moral people. Everyone is in some way or another. We have differing ethics and morals, but they're part of who we are as humans. So where does our ethical basis for how we treat software and software development come from? I've taken a look at this and actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about it, because as a human resources automation startup, we started off having to protect some of the most important information about human beings that it's possible to have. Things like private employee evaluations and social security numbers and emergency contact information. This is the kind of stuff that you don't want going all over the internet. And yet, as a startup, often there's not as many resources to do the kind of follow-up compliance and ex post facto documentation that a lot of people would like to see. So we started by building the most secure product we could. Oh, but wait, that's not entirely true. The product that we have is developed to the absolute limits of our capacity to be secure. But the truth is that no software ultimately is entirely secure. Nothing that's ever that is totally secure has ever even been built. Instead, what we do is we go back to the ethical origins of decision-making itself. And we tend to run under, in a startup, something that would be closely related to Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. The highest moral value is that which provides the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, just in case that sounds very familiar, part of the reason why we're having a discussion about ethics this week and what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people is because I think everybody here is very much missing Mr. Leonard Nimoy, and I've been thinking about Benthamite ethics and how we develop software. So when we ask ourselves if a particular feature needs to be implemented for security, for safety, for user feasibility, we ask ourselves the question, how many people will it impact? And for security, you err on the side of covering as much ground as you possibly can. And for feature development, you try to err towards Pareto optimal decision-making. If 80% of your users will use a feature, that's probably a pretty good indication that you're heading in the right direction with it. Often something that only a small minority, meaning something like 5 to 10% of your users or less will use, is not something that you're focused on to the point that you'll do as good a job on it as some other software suite or some other company would. So the ethics of our decision-making tends to be based in Pareto optimality and Benthamite ethics. And that's really where we come up with a lot of the decisions that we make. The next thing we can talk about is the nature of compliance in software development. Compliance is a pretty dry topic, and yet it's been on my mind a lot as a human resources startup and the kind of features that we end up developing. People ask me often, are you compliant? And I say, it depends on what your definition of compliance is, and it always does. There are different definitions of compliance. There is federal, there's regulatory, there's state and local compliance, there's business and standard industry practices, and at the same time, there's also internal compliance. I've seen a lot of work being done recently on the nature of shadow IT. And if you're a company that is a BYOD company, as Fizzmint is, what you're mainly focused on is making sure that your users inside the company are not using a a feature inappropriately. They're not doubling passwords up from site to site. Any startup is going to have multiple accounts that your developers need to use. Their GitHub, their email, their access to the internal applications, the intranet, everything like that. And one of the most important things I've actually found is when it comes to compliance, making sure that your users understand that having the same password for their email and for their development accounts, for their online accounts, is a firing offense, is one of the strongest measures of compliance that I've ever found. I used to, as a lot of people know, work at Microsoft, where I worked on the Halo team, on the Lips for Xbox team. And I remember, and many people there know, if you plug your computer's Ethernet cable directly into the Ethernet sockets at Microsoft, you are going to be immediately fired. There's very few measures of compliance that I ever found out about so quickly or adhered to so drastically and dramatically as one where if you put the data of the entire company at risk because every computer was on the internal intranet there, if you expose the intranet to the outside world, and there are always bots scanning every single IP address in the range assigned to Microsoft, you would be fired. There's no exceptions. And in a startup, the closest thing I think that you can really come to that is making everyone understand that their passwords cannot be the same from site to site, that it is a profoundly important piece of compliance. Whatever your compliance internally is, it's a good idea to pick at least one thing that you believe is going to solve 80% of the problems. And again, we're going back to Pareto optimality again here. Find that one thing you think is going to solve 80% of your possible problems and make it a huge priority. For Microsoft, they had to make sure that people weren't directly connecting internal machines to the outside world, to the outside range of IP addresses. And that was going to solve 80% of the problems. I agree with it entirely. I thought it was a great policy. And that's why at Fizzmint, we have the exact same policy on compliance for passwords instead. It makes a great deal of sense for you to figure out and implement a password policy very much like that if you're entirely in the cloud and you're SaaS like we are. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was, and we're going to get to a couple of questions here in 5 to 6 minutes, but let me go through the remainder. I've got a few people that want to ask some questions here. But let's get through the remainder of the points that I wanted to cover. One of the biggest things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to open source software and corporate compliance is the fundamental misunderstanding that many executives, managers, and non-technical people have in the corporate world about what open source software is. For so long, we kept software under lock and key. We kept development of software and the secret sauce behind the curtain, as it were. And as a result, people started thinking that if you understood how the software worked, you could crack it. So to try to get a non-engineer, a non-technical person to understand that open source software, where you may be protecting profoundly valuable data, but the programs, the applications, the software that you use can be physically seen, altered by, worked on by people that are not part of your company, seems strange and non-intuitive to a lot of people. And yet, open source software is often the single best choice that a bootstrapping startup can make because you're not dealing with as many of your own internal bugs for the software that you're developing. This is not news to many of you out there, but for those of you considering starting your own startup, don't fall into the trap right away of assuming that because someone offers you an enterprise level package software at an extremely cut rate for a period of time, that you're getting a better deal than free software. The reason for that, and I don't just mean OSS, I mean FOSS, free and open source software. I have seen some of the most secure companies in the world, companies like AT&T, and yes, I know about some of the breaches, companies like Silent Circle that I've done some consulting work for, all have the amazing cryptography, the amazing applications, and as much as they possibly can of their internal code, published out there as open source code. And publishing your code makes it so that people who are interested can find problems and errors in it. Companies that deal well with external developers finding errors in their code are much more secure and likely to be much more consumer and user oriented than companies that try to protect the way that their applications work to the detriment of the possibility of many eyes on their code finding mistakes, errors, and problems. Ultimately, your responsibility in the company is to the end user. And if the end user's product is insecure and buggy because of poor decision-making process to keep that away from people who can help you, then I do have some questions. I mean, again, there are a lot of great enterprise level packages out there that are not open source, and yet I see open source software as being a way for people to become part of your company without necessarily becoming part of your company. And I'm going to go off on some other topics in the future about open source software, especially as it relates to Fizzmint and how people have been able to use the kinds of OSS software that we use to develop amazing solutions. Okay, fourth, OSS is not a cure-all. Just because there can be many eyes on your software doesn't necessarily mean that there are many eyes on your software. So that doesn't mean that if you publish your code publicly, that you have completely and totally gotten rid of all of your own personal responsibility to ensure bug-free code, or at least as bug-free code as possible. It's not a cure-all, and just because a lot of people could look at your code doesn't mean they are. And even if thousands of people are poring over every single line in your code, and I have seen that happen when some companies have released their code for the first time, it doesn't mean that any of the really, really, really horrifying bugs in your code won't be discovered by someone who doesn't report them. It's less likely in the OSS world that that will happen, but when somebody's got a 0 day on your code, that means they're probably going to keep it, unless you have a reasonably decent bug bounty program or there's some kind of incentive for you to use their work in your intellectual property. So it's a tough decision sometimes. Now let's take a look finally at decision-making with no ethical guidelines, and I'll give you an example. When we develop out new features for the web application that lives on top of our stack at Fizzmint, one of the first things we ask, and there's always, as there should be at any startup, tension between the business and technical sides of the company. When Liz and I talk, we're not just speaking as Liz and Tarah, we're talking as the business and technical sides of the company. And we need to come together when it comes to a decision-making process. Sometimes what that means is that features get put by the wayside as we stop and do scaffolding to ensure that future features and future development is done on a secure and stable background. That doesn't always make me happy. I want to be able to promise features to our clients, to our investors. I want to be able to show them all the amazing new things that we've got coming out. And to be honest, it's a little harder to sell to an end user that you should use a product because there is 512 encryption in the background. They don't know necessarily always what that means. And as a result, often we are implementing a feature, and security is definitely a feature in Fizzmint's application suite. Often we're implementing a feature that is not clearly explainable to the end user other than it just makes you more safe. And yet, there's something that many of us need to recognize in the software development world that we don't and haven't yet, which is that we are the architects of the amount of information that will go missing and will be made public on human beings over the course of the next 2 minutes to 20 years. If Fizzmint is built to exacting security standards and it takes us longer to develop features, then that's simply the way that it has to work. And we believe that our chances of success are greater because we will face fewer security breaches down the road, and because we prepare our security breach response mechanism in advance. When you're the person, and this is the final piece of that I would say, when Liz and I have a question, I want a feature, and she wants to stop me and say, no, we need to make this repair first. What we do is we sit there and we ask ourselves, what's the press release going to look like one day? We absolutely have to develop new features. But when Liz comes to me and says, we need to implement encryption at this level and not this level, so I need to drop back and I need to fix this plugin and make it happen, and it's going to take extra time. I'm not going to be able to develop the feature that you want. And I push back at her because it's my job to try to make the company as successful as it can be financially and personally and socially and economically. We ask ourselves, what is the press release going to look like? Because one day we assume any one of our security features can be breached. If that security feature is breached one day, and if we did not put a good fix in place for it, or if we didn't build it into the code to begin with, what are the questions that I'm going to be asked one day? How am I going to justify my decision-making process? And I will tell you, it is extraordinarily rare that a major security fix isn't instantly dropped in as a priority over the top of any feature development. And if we have a feature that needs to be developed in place of a security fix, often it's one that's not going to go public regardless, or a piece of the company that isn't even exposed to the public yet. So when we prioritize things, we ask ourselves questions about our responsibility to the public. We absolutely ask ourselves how we want to explain our decision in the future, and how we would do so in small, non-technical words to a larger audience. If I am someone who runs, and one of a common client type for Fizzmint is someone who runs a high turnover business, agriculture, food service, hospitality. Someone who runs a high turnover business is going to have a specialty that is unlike mine. They're going to be someone who knows how to run a hotel. They know how to run a restaurant. They know how to run a farm. They know how to run a staffing agency, but they don't know what I know about software development. And if I can't explain to them in clear words why I made the choices and the decisions that I made about the security of their data to a level that makes them understand that I have put their safety and security first, then we're not making the right decisions. So the simple rules that Liz and I use when we decide how to handle security fixes inside the company and how to push out information about them is, how do I want to explain this to someone if their data gets breached one day because of my decision-making process? 2, can I explain in non-technical words to somebody outside the company in such a way that they would approve of my decision-making process? And finally, am I going to be deeply embarrassed one day when I have to explain why I said what I said or why I made the choice that I made? And Liz pushes back, and she does exactly what she's supposed to do when it comes to those kinds of technical decisions. So you will more often than not find me saying, no, we need to hold off on feature development and ensure that our end users are safe. We believe it's going to pay off in the long run to build the right scaffolding, the right secure scaffolding. And I don't think that there are too many people that would disagree with us on that. We are absolutely taking a chance that it'll take us longer to develop out features. And yet, I think that she and I both have to live with the decisions that we make, and neither one of us is willing to expose our internal user data to any kind of flawed process if we have the ability to fix it. All right. I have a few questions here that people have asked, and I'm going to go ahead and push them out. Let's see here. Okay, the very first question that I had here was one that was emailed to me a little bit ago. And the question, it was focused in on the OSS versus enterprise level software development. And the question is, let me just read it off here. If enterprise level software has already had all of the testing done on it, why are you advocating open source software as an option for startups? Wouldn't it be better just to pay somebody to do what their expertise is based in? That is an awesome question. A totally awesome question. So the nature of enterprise software versus OSS software is a false dichotomy on a lot of different levels. There's plenty of enterprise level software that is also open source software. Some of it, and most of it actually usually isn't free. There are usually multiple tiers to open source software. A good example might be something like GitHub. Many companies store their data, their code, on private repositories on GitHub. They can purchase additional enterprise level tiers, and yet GitHub itself publishes its code on its own site, which I think is a great move. I've done a lot of work teaching people how to put their information up on GitHub. Well, part of the reason that we do that, part of the reason companies post their code on a site like GitHub or Bitbucket or any of the other public code repositories people can work on them, is enterprise level software goes through that process of decision making that I just described, that me and Liz deal with on an everyday basis as we represent the two sides of the organization and come back and forth on feature development and technology. And in enterprise level software, something that's developed behind the scenes where you can't see how their application works, the additional psychological pressure of knowing that your code is going to show up in public and you're going to be judged on it often makes you experience and work harder on your code as a result of the knowledge that you're going to expose your code to the world. People are going to be able to see it. They're going to be able to challenge your decision-making process. And sometimes just the knowledge that other people are going to be able to see your code makes you write better code. It makes you ask just one little extra question. it makes your individual engineers recognize that their work is tied, their work and their reputation is tied to the code that they put up in public. And as a result, I feel like there is rather than building the kind of financial and internal structure needed to build really great enterprise level non-open source software, that OSS is an option for companies that don't have necessarily the budget or time to build that out. Instead, the psychological pressure exists on engineers and developers like me to develop good code because we know someone else is watching and not because we're getting paid a lot for it. Could be getting paid a lot for it in many of the great open source companies that I know of, but when you're bootstrapping a startup, you take what you can get when it comes to the outside eyes making sure that you're doing a good job on your code. So if you can get a great deal on enterprise level software, that is wonderful. Realize that you're going to be paying for security or for support over time as well. And with open source software as a bootstrap startup or even as a funded startup, you can often find a great deal more information on the web that can help you solve your problems. It's part of the reason why we have a Django stack, for instance, because we found a great community in the Python world. We found that Django was a great framework for us to use and that there's a lot of information that exists out there on it. So if you've got somebody who needs to dig into your code and fix it and you don't have the money for enterprise level support for your previously very inexpensive enterprise level package of non-OSS software, then now you've got a couple more options you didn't have before. Okay, the next question that I had was on the ethical nature. Okay, this is really funny. I think this is about the philosophy of software development and whether or not we can use a Machiavellian as opposed to a Benthamite philosophical bent for the way that we make ethical decisions. I think this is really awesome and fun. So Machiavellian political philosophy could actually be applied to software development. One of the key things that many people don't understand about Machiavellian philosophy is that the prince was considered to be a prologue. It was not intended to be the way that the world would end up with one strong-arming dictator at the top of the heap, but instead that the prince was intended to be a transitional manual that would let you get to a republic. And that's something that's discussed in Machiavelli's discourses on Livy. So the kind of decision-making process that would lead you to ask the question, does the end justify the means, is the kind of question that leads to rapid product development and prototyping. It's the kind of question that leads you to possibly skip out, I think, on documentation. And believe me, I know my Bentham and I know my Machiavellian. I'm down with both these guys. But Machiavellian process, essentially asking yourself, what is the end that's required to take it? Even if the end goal in mind is a virtuous one, are any of the intermediate steps non-virtuous and yet leading to a virtuous result, means that you may make a decision in that intermediate process that leaves you exposed in future. And that's deliberately the one that we chose to avoid by going with what I would certainly call a Benthamite ethical process when it comes to developing software. If we were to say we have the ultimate goal of making a profoundly secure and a good product, and we found in the intermediate process that the only way to get to the most secure product was to have a software check or package, I don't know, something from Adobe or something like that, one of the really expensive ones, that would provide us with the kind of options that we needed to develop a great feature or a great security fix. And yet we couldn't afford it as a bootstrap startup. And I said, that's okay, I know where to go find that. And I went and pirated the software. Now, the ultimate end goal is to ensure a secure and safe and feature-driven application set on top of our framework. And yet, having used an intermediate process that was not as ethical as it could have been, or does not abide by good software development processes, even if the end is a product that is better than the one that you could have provided otherwise, means that you are perpetually exposing yourself to the consequences of that decision. Each one of those decisions on the way to the goal is still it's still something that you may have to pay consequences for later. One of the ways that we find that happens is people who use pirated software often find that whatever they have created on that pirated software is now the property of the company that owns whatever they pirated. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that's perfectly fair. If you are using something that is not abiding by a license or regulation, or you didn't pay for the product you're using, and you're in a startup, then honestly, you're doing everything at your own risk. I don't feel like that's a good decision-making process when you're responsible not just for the well-being of your team and the good of your company, but also when you're responsible for end-user data. People need to know that the people that are in charge of their information are making the best decision they possibly can, both when it comes to security and usability. And that's probably the best way that I can put the decision-making process and why I didn't go with Machiavellian. I'm still a fan of Machiavellian political thought once we get to discourses, but we'll deal with that later. That's just fun stuff. So the final question that I'm going to be able to answer today is one about compliance. And the question was, at what point do I need to start worrying about compliance in my nascent startup? And this is someone he's got a startup and he's wondering at what point I need to start worrying about compliance. I would say the first thing you need to ask yourself is, has anyone taken for granted the security measures that you have put in place? And I happen to know that this is a 2-3 person company, and he wants to build compliance in from the very beginning. As a bootstrapped startup, compliance is tough because often people think of compliance as ex post facto documentation of screw-ups. And in a lot of ways, it can be that. But the idea here is to drive behavior, not to document it. So compliance is something that needs to be, it's not a dirty word. It's the kind of thing that people understand are the rules of the game. They're the rules of being part of a company, the rules of developing the product that you're going to develop. And rather than asking yourself, when should I start worrying about compliance, recognize that you already have. It's just that you have unspoken compliance. Whatever the expectations are that you have on other people there about their behavior, that's part of compliance. Part of compliance, for instance, is expecting that people will not throw water on their keyboards. Now that is a very sensible piece of compliance. It's or throw water on the hard drives, or let somebody who they don't know use their computer while they go take off to the bathroom for a while. Now, that right there is compliance, that expectation. You don't have it documented. So what I think you mean is, when do I need to start documenting what the rules are and what the rules of compliance are? And I would argue that there is no time like before you start your startup. Start writing down the rules of expectation. You will find yourself adding more and more to them. And I know people don't like the wiki solution, but often it's the best one that you can get to, because at least it's there and people can find it. We started documenting for compliance the minute that Liz and I founded the company. And we started doing that first in emails. And we realized that we were starting to document compliance in emails back and forth when one of us would say, well, just go look at that email. That's the one that said how I was going to do the thing that I said I was going to do. And then one of us was like, no, this is stupid. We need to have this written in a single location that is editable, updatable, and that has version control. So the wiki in the startup is often kind of the boogeyman, and yet it's probably your best option for compliance documentation. It's clear, it's public, and people understand if it's not perfect or up to date, and you can continue to fix it as you go. Eventually, that wiki for many companies turns into an employee handbook. In fact, it's probably turning close to that at Fizzmint already. I've already seen most of the headings out there that people are posting information. And compliance also needs to be something that your entire company takes part in. This is not you writing the rules down and expecting everybody to abide by them, mostly because you can't control what all the rules are going to be. You set the tone. But the truth is that a team that you don't necessarily work on, if you're the CEO of a company that has more than, say, 5 to 10 people in it, you're not going to be the one setting all of the rules of compliance. You'll be able to set the tone for them. You will be able to monitor them for common sense. But there's no way to come up with rules for every single situation. It's why you hire people that you trust, and why you instill in them the knowledge that ultimately it's a better idea to sacrifice a feature for the moment than to ultimately not protect the end consumer. Most of the people that use Fizzmint don't understand security features or have worked in cryptography like I have, like Liz has. And as a result, it's our job to act responsibly on their part, on their behalf. And it may sound facile, but I am hoping that the people that use my product, who bake pies, who fix cars, who run hotels, who run agencies, who create products for other people, are acting as ethically on my behalf as I try to act on their behalf behind the scenes. I'll never see most of the decisions that an agricultural preserve or a baker makes on my behalf to not use adulterated foods, even when they could get away with it. And yet I hope and expect that they'll act ethically on my part and on my behalf. And I do my best to act ethically on the part of people that don't have my expertise and center of knowledge. And if you do the same, you're going to find that you are much better able to sleep at night. And in the long run, you'll have many, many fewer legal and financial problems as you deal with the mess that you created. So that is the best information that I can give you today on open source software, startups, ethical decision making when it comes to feature development, as opposed to security fixes and scaffolding and stability in the cloud especially. So thank you very much. I will not be here next week. I will, however, be here on March 18th for an awesome new special event. We're going to have some male allies aboard. We're going to talk about what it takes to be a really great ally to women in technology. And I'm going to do a lot of listening, and I'm really looking forward to experiencing some of the thoughts that some great friends and allies of mine have about how they, and many of them you won't even know because they're from behind the scenes, because they do this work behind the scenes. And yet, I would love to introduce you to some of them. They're just wonderful people, and you're going to have a great time with them. It's March 18th. I will talk to you all very, very soon. Have a lovely, lovely day. Goodbye.